Well, Sami Hamdi is a Middle East expert and editor-in-chief of the International Interest. He joins us from London with more. Sami, thank you for being with us. What were the underlying factors in the region that led to the formation of Daesh?
I think the main thing was mainly the marginalization of the Sunni population. The reason why I say this is because it was in these areas that ISIS managed to expand. Let's remember Maliki's increasing sectarian policies in Iraq, the way the Kurds were already mobilized and already in a group. There was only one group left that had no real political representation or found no ways in which to address their grievances. So when all of a sudden you have these fanatics claiming a revolution against Baghdad and they're marching to Baghdad, when they claimed, remember ISIS, when they emerged, they didn't necessarily declare the caliphate. They declared themselves to be some sort of revolution. So many of these people with the grievances, many people from the former Ba'ath party itself that had been ousted in Iraq were more than happy to cooperate with this group that that provided a genuine challenge to the status quo in these regions. So it was an amalgamation of all of these years of grievances following the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and they played on these grievances in order to maintain their strongholds. In other words, for many of the people in the areas they were governing, or the areas that they were in, where they had their strongholds, it was either ISIS or a brutal sectarian government. And in their eyes, they were both as equal as each other.
Okay, so you brought up some interesting points there when you mentioned the long, slow-burning grievances. So what does the region need to do in addressing some of those issues affecting parts of the population that might be attracted to joining extremist groups like Daesh? I'm talking about mainly young men. I'm talking about issues about poverty, lack of education and so forth.
I don't think it's necessarily just to do with poverty or necessarily lack of education. I mean, you have to remember that we have to address a narrative that is taking place in the region, which is incessant invasions, incessant bombings, all of this material that is being used by ISIS in order to attract foreign fighters. Moreover, when you have across Europe a rise of Islamophobia, you have Brexit, which was mainly a xenophobic-driven vote. When you have France, François Hollande, the former president, saying France is at risk of Islamic terrorism. When you have Angela Merkel saying that we discussed with President Erdogan how to fight Islamist terrorism, this rhetoric all feeds into ISIS's message, which is that the Europeans, they don't want you. The Westerners, they don't want you. Your home is with us. They feed on that identity. And I think one of the biggest evidences of this play on identity is in the reaction that many people have, for example, to this recent drama that's emerged from Turkey of Dirilish Ertuğrul, Resurrection Ertuğrul, which is providing this Islamic identity. The reaction to it shows there is a thirst for it. And Daesh were providing some answer to that particular space. I'm not saying they appeal to mainstream Muslims or the like. What I'm saying is the defiance that they had to these particular regimes, to these governments that were causing oppression to these various different areas, that is the message that appealed to many of these people who jumped on the bandwagon. Of course, when we're talking about ISIS today, how do we address the grievances? These grievances are not being addressed. The Sunnis in Iraq are still being marginalized. In Syria, we still have incessant bombing. We still have the Russians and Assad regime who look like they're on the forefront and that Assad may genuinely stay in Syria. You still have a sectarian government in Baghdad. All of the factors that promoted ISIS, that created ISIS, are still in place today. So when we're listening earlier about whether the ideology still exists, we're still in this environment where an organization like ISIS can still emerge.
Okay, so in that case, when is it, how long is it before it is likely to re-emerge?
To be honest, that's a very interesting question. At this moment in time, I think the ISIS ideology, or if we can even call it an ideology, is being taken up by some of the other groups that are fighting in Syria, even if we don't want to necessarily name them or point to them and say that they are ISIS. At the end of the day, when the US says it is fighting terrorism in Syria, it doesn't necessarily just mean ISIS. It means the likes of Jabhat al-Nusra, which formally announces allegiance to Al-Qaeda and then reneged on that particular allegiance. So I mean, until we're talking about extremist ideology, it still exists. It's still there. There's still groups that are able to attract that. But what I do think with regards to ISIS, why we will not see the emergence of ISIS in the way that we saw it when it suddenly just emerged, is because you don't get bitten from the same hand twice. In other words, there is very real military control now in the areas in Iraq where ISIS first emerged via the Popular Mobilization Force. There's very real airstrikes. The movement of the SDF, the Kurdish forces, the movement of Russian airstrikes, the movement of the regime forces. There's no real space for these grievances to manifest itself. So when we say it's a matter of time, will ISIS re-emerge again? I think ISIS are here, not necessarily in the same form as they were beforehand, but if we're talking about extremist groups, they will continue to exist for as long as these grievances remain.
Okay, Sami Hamdi in London there for us. Thank you for joining us.